Welcome to the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center's Curator's Corner. My name is Thorin Tritter. I'm the Museum and Programming Director at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center, which is located in Glen Cove, New York. Let me just adjust my camera a little. There we go. Before we start, I wanted to share 4 pieces of information. The first is our building's open. So I hope that you'll be inspired by this program and some of my other Curator's Corners to come and visit our museum in person and see the objects and images that I talk about in their place in our gallery. The second thing I wanted to say is just as I always do, to encourage you, if you have questions, to type them into the Q&A box, and I'll do what I can to answer them either when they come in or at the end of my presentation. And as I've been talking about recently, I also wanted to share the fact that we have launched a Buy a Brick campaign. So you can honor a friend or family member, somebody you care about, by creating a personalized brick that will be placed in the patio or on the patio overlooking our Children's Memorial Garden. So you can find out more information on our website. And finally, if you are interested in sponsoring one of our program series, our Curator's Corner series or our Sunday with Survivors, please reach out to my colleague Gail Peck, the Director of Development here, and she can talk to you more about that opportunity. Okay. So with those 4 announcements taken care of, let's get to today's program. I want today to talk about this photograph that stands in our 5th gallery, which shows the Nuremberg Trials, which opened on November 20th, 1945, and announced their first verdict 75 years ago last month. Before I talk more about the photograph and trials, let me just put in a thank you to Professor John Barrett at St. John's University, one of the leading scholars in the world on the Nuremberg Trials, and he kindly shared his expertise with me in preparation for this program. So I want to publicly just thank Professor John Barrett. Here is the caption that accompanies our photograph in our gallery. From 1945 to 1946, the International Military Tribunal tried 22 Nazi leaders in Nuremberg, Germany for war crimes, crimes against humanity. Very few Nazis were imprisoned. It offers a succinct summary, that caption, but it leaves much unsaid. And I wanted to talk today about that photograph and some of what we're unable to fit into the brief space of the caption. To back up, let me give a bit of background and repeat what you may well know already about the Nuremberg Trials. As our caption says, the photograph is from the International Military Tribunal. This is perhaps the most well-known post-war trial that sought to provide some measure of justice after the Holocaust. But it was neither the first, nor the last, nor the largest. It is probably the most well-known. In October of 1943, the leaders of the Allied powers met in Moscow for a series of 12 meetings about working cooperatively in the fight against Nazi Germany. One of the 4 main outcomes of that meeting was the Moscow Declaration of German Atrocities, signed by US President Franklin Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin. And the declaration stated that at the time of the armistice, when the Germans surrendered, the Germans would be deemed responsible for atrocities, massacres, or executions. And those Germans who were deemed responsible for those atrocities and massacres would be sent back to those countries where the crimes had been committed in order to be judged and punished. But the declaration added that major war criminals whose crimes could be assigned to no particular geographic location would be punished by a joint decision of the Allied governments. Of course, in October of 1943, when the Moscow Conference took place, Allied victory was hardly a sure thing. As hopefully you can see on this map, the Red Army in November 1st of 1943 had gained a little bit of headway in the Ukraine, and the United States had at least arrived in the southern part of Italy. But this was 8 months before the D-Day landing in France, and the Nazis and their allies, shown here in white, controlled the great majority of Europe. In early 1945, 2 years later, with Allied victory much more clearly in sight, the leaders met in Yalta, where Roosevelt proposed more details and urged that an international tribunal should be convened to try Nazi leaders for planning and waging a war of aggression and for war crimes. And in August of 1945, in the wake of the final surrender of Germany, the European Advisory Commission, which had been established during the Moscow Conference, issued the Nuremberg Charter, setting down the rules and procedures for an international military tribunal to try three categories of crimes: crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The first war crimes trial, however, was held before August of 1945. It was held in July of 43 in the Soviet, it was held by the Soviet military, which met in Krasnodar, a city in southern Russia, for the trial of 11 defendants, all members of the German military, German police, or the SS, who were accused of participating in the murder of 7,000 people during the German occupation of Krasnodar. All 11 men were found guilty, 8 were hanged, and 3 received prison sentences. There were literally, though, dozens of other war crimes trials, mostly held after the war in cities all across Europe. This map shows the site of the trials where they were held, and you get a sense of the broad effort to use the courts across Europe to find justice after the war. But it was the first international military tribunal, which concluded 75 years ago last month, that would become, as I said, the most well-known, and that is the trial that's captured in our photograph. Our photograph captures the first day of that trial on November 20th, 1945, so 76 years ago on this coming Saturday, when the indictments against 22 of the top surviving German leaders were read out. The man shown standing at the podium is Sidney Alderman, one of the chief members of the US prosecution team. He's captured in the process, in our photo, of reading more than 90 pages of the indictment. Behind Alderman, you can see most of the 4 tables that were set up in the courtroom, each for the 4 countries who were serving as prosecutors. The largely empty table behind Alderman's left shoulder was for the American prosecution team, which was headed by American Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson. President Truman had tapped Jackson to serve as the US Chief of Counsel for the prosecution of the Nazi war crimes trial. A close look at the photograph, however, shows that Justice Jackson is not in the courtroom, at least during this photo, and that is in fact a clue to when it was taken. He was still working on his opening statement, which he would make the following day on November 21st. The table behind Alderman's other shoulder, which we only see a few chairs from, was the British prosecution table. And further to the right in the photograph is the Russian table, and then the French. One of the challenges posed by having the international tribunal held by 4 partner nations was the fact that the 4 prosecuting teams were all structured as equals, with no one person overseeing or managing the entirety of the trial. Instead, the chief prosecutors from the 4 countries met and divvied up the responsibilities and then decided on the approach for their portion. So the US handled count 1, which was conspiracy to commit crimes against peace. The UK count 2, crimes against peace, and the Soviet Union count 3, war crimes, while the French had count 4, crimes against humanity. They also divvied up cross-examination of witnesses and defendants. So there was a lot of dividing of this trial. But there was also a lot of overlap and repetition. One clue in our photograph about who is speaking is the fact that nobody on the American or British tables is wearing a headset, as instant translation was provided in various languages. And you can see here that some of the Russian prosecutors, as well as some of the defense attorneys sitting in the front right part of our photograph, are wearing the headset and getting the translation. Most people are also reading along with Sidney Alderman, as they were all given copies of the indictment that Alderman is going through. Alderman and the rest of the 4 prosecuting teams made their case to an international tribunal of judges with 1 primary judge and 1 alternate from each of the 4 countries. Those judges are actually outside the frame of our photograph, but another image from the same day shows Alderman at that podium and the panel of judges to his right. Perhaps this is a a nicer photo or clearer photo gives you a look at the picture of the judges. The left end of the table are the Russian judges, then British, then American, led by Francis Biddle on the left, who FDR had named as the U.S. Attorney General during the war, and then Truman named as the main judge for the Nuremberg Trials. And finally, the French judges all the way to the right. The other key group in our photograph, of course, are the defendants. After much debate, 24 defendants were chosen to represent a cross-section of Nazi diplomatic, economic, political, and military leadership, but only 21 appeared in the court. Notably missing from the 24, or the 21, were Adolf Hitler, Heinrich Himmler, and Joseph Goebbels, all of whom committed suicide before the end of the war. The IMT, the International Military Tribunal, decided not to try them posthumously because they did not want to create the impression that any of those three men were still alive. Three others chosen for the trial also did not appear: Martin Bormann, Gustav Krupp, and Robert Ley. Nazi Party Secretary Martin Bormann was tried and convicted in absentia at the time because it was not clear whether Bormann was dead or had escaped Germany. Many years later, his remains were identified, and scholars agree that he died during the Battle of Berlin on May 2nd, 1945, so before this trial took place. Gustav Krupp, the German industrialist, was included in the original indictment, but because of his age, he was 75 years old in 1945, and had failing health, it was decided to exclude him from the proceedings. He would actually die 5 years later in 1950. And finally, the head of the German Labor Front, Robert Ley, who was initially to be included, but committed suicide on the eve of the trial, so he was not present. That left 21 defendants, of which 12 are shown in our photograph. I won't go through them all, but the highest ranking Nazi to be tried is the man in that front row, all the way to the left, Hermann Goering, who had served in various positions, including the head of the Luftwaffe and the head of the four-year plan. Next to Goering is Rudolf Hess, a personal aide to Hitler, who also served as the deputy party leader of the Nazi Party. And next to Hess is Joachim von Ribbentrop, the Nazi foreign minister, who played a role in the annexation of Bohemia, the attack on Poland, and worked to persuade the leaders of occupied countries to deport Jews to Nazi concentration camps. Here's a different photograph, a famous photograph that shows all 21 defendants present in the International Military Tribunal. Bormann was the 22nd defendant, but as I said, he was tried in absentia. The trial went on for almost a year, with the judges delivering their verdict on October 1st, 1946. 3 of the 4 judges had to agree in order to convict any of the defendants on any count. In the end, 12 of the defendants were sentenced to death. 10 of them were hanged on October 16th, 1946. Hermann Goering committed suicide the night before his sentence was to be carried out, and Martin Bormann, as we later found out, was already dead. 3 of the other defendants received life imprisonment, and 4 others received prison terms between 10 and 20 years. 3 were acquitted. Let me add a few more points about our photograph and what it shows and does not show. First, I think you'll agree that it looks like what you would expect a trial to look like. There are lawyers, judges, defendants, a lot of paper. And we know this was a snapshot that was part of a very long, drawn-out trial. In many ways, I think the photograph captures what the Allied powers wanted people to see. The International Military Tribunal, as the first trial after the war that was jointly held by all 4 Allied powers, was a major news event. The Allied powers wanted to show that the Nazi leaders were being held accountable, but they also wanted to show that this trial was legal. They wanted to highlight the differences between the judicial process under Nazi rule, where the law was whatever the Führer said it was, and the judicial process in countries like England, America, and France. Stalinist Russia, of course, was a different story, but in general, the Allies wanted to show that they were providing a fair trial where the final decision of guilt was based on the body of evidence and of the rule of law. One of the things that is not clear from our photograph, however, is about what followed this trial. The 10 hangings were carried out, but the prison sentences were often far shorter than the original sentences that were made. Of the 3 defendants who were punished with life imprisonment, only one, Rudolf Hess, served the full term. The 2 others were released by 1957. Erich Raeder, the commander-in-chief of the German Navy, was sentenced to life but was released after 10 years in 1955. And Walter Fund, Hitler's Minister of Economics, was sentenced to life but released in 1957 after 11 years, again, or in his case, because of ill health. And while 3 of the 4 who received prison sentences of between 10 and 20 years served the full term, all of them were out of jail by 1966 and were able to live out their lives in Germany. And this was the trial of the leading Nazis. I guess my point here is that our photo captures a snapshot of what we wanted justice to look like, but sometimes justice is hard to define. Does the hanging of 10 leading Nazis bring justice to the victims? Did 20-year sentences bring justice, or 10 or 5? And how do you hold an entire nation accountable? And that is one other point that I think often gets lost when looking at a photograph like ours. When Americans talk about the Nuremberg Trials, I think they often confuse the various post-war trials. Our photograph is from the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg, which tried 22 defendants. But the unity of the Allied powers faded by 1946 and 1947. So the subsequent 12 trials held in Nuremberg were held as American military tribunals without the Russian, British, or French, who set up their own post-war trials. They were not international military tribunals. In those 12 follow-up trials, the United States tried 177 defendants, 161 of whom were convicted and 16 were acquitted. 37 of the 161 who were convicted were sentenced to death. The other 140 of all the defendants were given prison sentences of various lengths. Those numbers sound like justice was served. 180 convictions overall and almost 50 sentences of death. It's a small percentage of the population of Germany, but it includes the conviction of almost 200 leading Nazi figures. But what happened after the sentences were given shows a very different picture. Sadly, even just a little bit of digging shows a shocking distinction between the sentences that were issued and what people actually served. In the doctor's trial, for instance, which was the first follow-up trial, there were 23 defendants, 7 were executed, 7 were acquitted, and 9 were given prison sentences that ranged from life down to 10 years. But when you look at those that went to prison, the most that anyone served was 8 years. The names in blue, if you can see it in my slide here, are the people who were sentenced to between 10 and 20 years, but none of them served more than 5. The names in red are people who were sentenced to life, but none of them served more than 8 years. And of the total 65 years given in prison sentences that were handed out to the non-life sentences, only 18 of those years were actually served. In the lawyers and judges trial, 4 people received life sentences and 6 were given sentences of between 5 and 10 years. But everyone, including those who had gotten life, everyone was released within a decade. And in the I.G. Farben trial of 1947 and 48, of the 23 defendants, almost half, 10 of the 23 were acquitted. And of the 13 who received prison sentences, 7 were released in a year or less, and only 2 people served more than 2 years. Perhaps the most troubling case is what happened after the Einsatzgruppen trial, the trial of 24 commanders of the mobile death squads that operated behind the Nazi front lines and murdered almost 2 million people, mostly with bullets. All 24 were found guilty, but of the 14 defendants who received death sentences, only 4 of those death sentences were carried out, One other person died in 1955. The other 9 were all released within 15 years. And for the 10 people sentenced to prison, 1 committed suicide, 1 died in 1948, but 5 were released after 3 years or less. And the final 3, who had been sentenced to 20 years each, were released within 6 years. So while we can say of the 199 defendants tried in Nuremberg, 180 were convicted and 49 were sentenced to death, a closer look shows that most of those punished were out of jail by the late 1950s, even those who had been convicted of the death penalty. What explains the disparity between the sentences given in the trials and the actual sentences served? One major factor for sure was the rise of the Cold War. And America's decision that it needed the expertise of Nazis to fight the Soviet Union. Many of the Nazis who were convicted had great experience in fighting with the Soviet Union, and so became a source of a valuable source to the American military and to American covert operations. The American government backpedaled and stopped pushing for prosecutions or for the punishments. Germany was also not interested in pushing the prosecutions as it sought to get past the war. Germany as a nation wanted to move forward and not be constantly reminded of its previous misdeeds. Commuting the sentences of convicted Nazis and not going forward with death sentences all helped to reduce the news coverage and publicity that might have meant more talk about the war. The topic that I'm touching on here, of course, deserves much more attention than I can dedicate to it here. But I wanted to highlight, even briefly, and I've been racing through it, I know, I wanted to highlight that our photograph is the tip of a very complicated iceberg, one that shows the ideal of justice after the Holocaust, but one that also hides the reality of the outcome of the post-war trials. And one, I believe, that raises the larger questions about what justice means and how could there be justice in the wake of something like the Holocaust. I'm going to stop there. Thank you for watching. And of course, if you have questions, and I see there are some, please type them in the Q&A window. Before I get to those, let me put in a plug for our upcoming programs. This coming Sunday, we'll be holding a program about the way the Festival of Hanukkah was celebrated in Europe during the Holocaust and in the DP camps after the war. Our Director of Education, Dr. Avi Markovitz, will speak about what traditions were followed in the ghettos and concentration camps and DP camps. And next Monday, we have a program with Sylvia Foti about some of what she uncovered about how Lithuania remembers the Holocaust or misremembers the Holocaust that she discovered while writing her book, The Nazi's Granddaughter, How I Discovered My Grandfather Was a War Criminal. The book is eye-opening, and I know that she's going to be presenting an interesting story, so I hope you'll join us for that. And one more program to mention, next Wednesday, I'll be back for my Curator's Corner. I thought I would try and do something related to Thanksgiving, and so I'm going to be talking about our DP camp exhibition and share some thoughts about giving thanks for the end of World War II. You can find a full list of our programs on our website at www.hmtcli.org and click on the events tab. And I also hope you'll click on the Give Now button and make a donation to support our ongoing online programs. Thanks very much. Let me see about your questions. Were there any prominent Jewish officials among the prosecutors in any of the 4 prosecuting countries? I know in the American case, there were several Jewish judges and Jewish prosecutors. Ben Ferencz is probably the most famous, a guy who's still alive, and he was one of the prosecutors. But I don't know about in the other countries. That's something I'll have to look up. But yes, there certainly were Jews on the prosecution teams for the American side. What was the reaction of the German people to the trials, the sentences, and the publicity? I think overall, the non-Jewish Germans, as I said, wanted to move past the war. And so were not particularly eager to pay attention to these trials or to highlight them or to celebrate the fact that justice might have been done. This is right in the wake of the war. Germany was in difficult shape financially and economically. Just physically, Germany had been decimated by the fighting, with the buildings torn down. And if you've ever seen the film Justice at Nuremberg with Spencer Tracy, a great film, it shows some footage of him coming into Nuremberg where the trials were held and just seeing the devastation of the city. The city was in ruins. So I think there was a desire by Germans to not pay a whole lot of attention to this trial, just because they didn't want these trials, because they didn't want to focus on what had been done, and also because their focus was very much on other things. Somebody mentions that their aunt was a translator and interrogator at Nuremberg. That's amazing. So yeah, I know that people have familial connections to this. So thanks very much. All right, well, thank you for joining the program today, and I hope to see you at some of our other programs soon. Have a nice weekend and a happy Thanksgiving if I don't see you before then. Be well.